am I calling? This is going to be like 10 minutes long. All right, Judges chapter number 7. Let's pick it up in verse 16. Judges chapter number 7 and verse 16. We're still speaking about Gideon, and Lord willing, we're going to finish with Gideon tonight. We got up to choosing or whittling down his army, so he is now down to 300 soldiers in his army. And, when you're going up against 135,000 and you only started out with 35,000 or 32,000, 300 is not a good number. That's already a strange tactic. All right? We're already in the strange. But the Lord likes to work in the strange, because the way that he tells Gideon to defeat this army, we stay in the strange. So in verse number 16, here's some more commands about those 300. It says, and he divided the 300 men into 3 companies. That's not wise. If you're already going against 135,000 and you only have 300, you don't want to divide them up into smaller groups. But he divides them up into now groups of 100. And then he put a bazooka, a machine gun, and a 50 cal sniper rifle in each hand. Is that what your King James Bible says? It says, and he put a trumpet in every man's hand with empty pitchers and lamps within the pitchers. I don't see he's checking me on live stream. I don't see a weapon here. I see a trumpet. I see a pitcher that you're supposed to carry water in. And then I see a torch inside the pitcher. Do you guys read that too? So again, we're starting out strange, and we're just staying strange. This is not in the top 10 best ways to conquer an enemy. It's not in that list. And then verse 17, and he said unto them, look on me and do likewise, and behold, when I come to the outside of the camp, that it shall be as I do, so shall ye do. So Gideon's not saying you go and you do. What is he saying? Do as I do. What I do, you do. So he's leading by example. You know, that's important for us to see here. That's important for his men as well. Because again, we're going up against 135,000 soldiers with 300, and all we have in our hands is a trumpet, a pitcher, and a lamp in the pitcher. So lead by example. Verse 18, when I blow with the trumpet, I and all that are with me, then blow ye the trumpets also on every side of the camp, and say the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. So Gideon and the 100 men that were with him came to the outside of the camp in the beginning of the middle of the watch, or in the beginning of the middle watch. And they had but newly set the watch, and they blew the trumpets and brake the pitchers that were in their hands. Now let's talk about what's going on here. What the Lord had Gideon do was, if the top of my pulpit is the valley, and the edge is the mountain where Gideon is, Gideon placed his men on three sides of the army, like this. So there's 100 men here, 100 men here, and 100 men here, and he left this open for them to flee, and we're going to see that in just a moment. And so Gideon walked. Now, there's not street lights. There isn't any ambient light. They're out in the wilderness. He's on a mountain. They're in a valley. So there's no light. And the middle watch that we're talking about here is between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. Did you read that with me? In verse number 19, came to the outside of the camp in the beginning of the middle watch. Again, that time frame is 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. And then it says, and they had but newly set the watch. And so you have guys that are tired, and they're kind of dragging their swords behind them like this, and they're kind of holding their torch down like this because they're tired from being on watch. So they're not really watching. Right? And then you got the new guys coming on. They're rubbing the sleep out of their eyes because they just woke up out of their tents. They just got their clothes on. They just strapped their sword on, so their sword's kind of dragging behind them a little bit. Their lamp is kind of hanging low because they're rubbing the sleep out of their eyes, and they're coming on. They haven't gotten that alert yet. So nobody's alert at the change of the watch. And this is the time that the Lord tells Gideon to do three things. Verse number 20. In the verse 19. And they blew the trumpets and break the pitchers that were in their hands. Now, do you think that the Midianites had their boom boxes on at night? Do you think any of them are walking around with their Walkmans on? Do you guys remember those? Do you think they got their AirPods in their ears? Probably the only sounds that they can hear are the wilderness sounds. Maybe crickets, maybe a coyote, maybe a scorpion skittering on the ground. And all of a sudden, 300 trumpets. Now, these are those shofars, so these are ram's horns. In the middle of the night. Would you be a little perturbed? Would you be frightened? It's quiet, and then all of a sudden, 300 horns are going off. And then right after that, 300 glass breaking. And then all of a sudden, all around you, the mountaintop is lit up. Would you be a little scared? Well, let's see what happens to these guys. The three companies blew, I'm in verse number 20, blew the trumpets, break the pitchers, and held the lamps in their left hands and the trumpets in their right hands to blow withal. And they cried, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. Do you guys remember the dream? Remember when Gideon and Phurah go down into the camp and they hear the Midianites, their dream and the interpretation of the dream? And the interpretation, this is none else than the sword of the Lord and or of Gideon, the son of Joash. And so what they cry in the middle of the night, this is the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. And verse 21 has something that's pretty important in it. And they stood, every man in his place, round about the camp. If Gideon's 300 men would have moved down the mountainside to come into the camp, the Midianites would have seen the movement, and they would have only seen 300 men. And they wouldn't have been scared. But because the 300 men stood in their place with their lamps up and shouting the sword of the Lord and of Gideon, the Midianites were thinking, okay, well, those are the ones we can see. They're staying in their place. They're lighting the way for the multitudes of soldiers that are coming down in the darkness that we can't see. That was frightening to them, what they could not see. And so when we read in verse 21, and they stood every man in his place round about the camp, look what happened down in the valley. And the host ran and cried and fled. 135,000 men of war crying like little girls. They ran and cried and fled. Verse 22, and the 300 blew the trumpets, and the Lord set every man's sword against his fellow, even throughout all the host. And the host fled to Beth Shittah and Sererath, and to the border of Abel Maholah, and unto Tabbath. So with all the noise and all the ruckus and those 300 torches just sitting there, these people got, and they're running and crying and fleeing, and in the darkness and in the shadows, they see somebody running up to them and a glint of a sword, so they start swinging their swords, and they end up killing themselves. They end up killing themselves. And so they escape. Now, you remember I told you on this part of my pulpit, this was the place that they could escape. They ran this way, but while running this way, they're killing themselves. Verse 23, and the men of Israel gathered themselves together out of Naphtali, out of Asher, and out of Manasseh, and pursued after the Midianites. Now, these men were not part of the 300. The Lord had gathered together his 300 special forces, if you will. But the rest of those armies, the rest of the army that was not qualified to be part of the 300, they were still around and they were able to pursue. That's who these men are. And Gideon sent messengers throughout all of Ephraim, saying, come down against the Midianites and take before them the waters unto Beth-bara and Jordan. Then all the men of Ephraim gathered themselves together and took the waters unto Beth-bara and Jordan. And they took two princes of the Midianites, Oreb and Zeb. I love those names. Zeb. And by the way, in Hebrew, I looked it up because I really wanted to know if their names were Oreb and Zeb. It's Oreb or Oreb. It's Zeb. I really wanted to look that up and see. So Oreb and Zeb with the Z sound. So Oreb, some pretty cool things here. Oreb means raven. Zeb means wolf. And so the men and the soldiers, not the 300, but the other men of the children of Israel, followed them. They slew Oreb, they slew Zeb. Then they brought their heads to Gideon. You see that all throughout verse number 25 there. Now, real quick, let's close out the story. Drop down to chapter 8 and verse 22. The first part of chapter number 8, there's some details there about some arguments between the Ephraimites and Gideon and, just infighting and stuff like that. But we get down to verse 22. Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, rule thou over us, both thou and thy son's sons also, for thou hast delivered us from the hand of Midian. And Gideon said unto them, I will not rule over you, neither shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. And Gideon said unto them, I would desire a request of you, that you would bring me, every man, the earrings of his prey, for they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. And they answered, we will willingly give them. And they spread a garment and did cast therein every man the earrings of his prey. And the weight of the golden earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, beside ornaments and collars and purple raiment that was on the kings of Midian, and beside the chains that were about their camels' necks. And here's what Gideon did with it. And Gideon made an ephod thereof, and put it in a city, even in Ophrah. And all Israel went thither, a-whoring after it. Gideon made this ephod, and all of the children of Israel went and worshiped it. They made the ephod a god. You know, a lot of people have asked, you've heard of the Shroud of Turin? Why wouldn't that be real? Well, if the Shroud of Turin was real, then people would worship it. By the way, where is it? Isn't it in a museum or in a Catholic church, and isn't somebody worshiping it? What about the Ark of the Covenant? Why isn't Indiana Jones real, and we didn't really find the Ark of the Covenant? And it really might be in some place in D.C., but if you read the scriptures, you know that it was cut up into little bitty pieces and melted down. But why wouldn't the Ark of the Covenant be something that we would want to have today? We would be going to it and worshiping it, just like these children of Israel were doing with the ephod that Gideon had made. The natural inclination of a man is to worship something that he can see. It's hard to worship something that you can't see. And so he made this ephod. Let's read the verse again. Gideon made an ephod thereof and put it in the city, even in Ophrah. And all Israel went thither a-whoring after it, which thing became a snare unto Gideon and to his house. So it was kind of his downfall. Well, an ephod was the breastplate. If you read in the Old Testament, there was a breastplate and it had 12 stones on it. And the high priest would wear that. And so it was a breastplate. Verse 28, Midian subdued, thus was Midian subdued before the children of Israel, so they lifted up their heads no more. And the country was in quietness 40 years in the days of Gideon. So how much rest did they have because of Gideon? They had 40 years. They had 40 years. And so we see what happened with the battle. We see that there were some strange tactics going on. We see the specific kind of leadership there, do as I do. And then those men keeping the command of standing still, and just the way the Lord wrought a great victory there and delivered the Midianites into the hand of Gideon and the children of Israel. All right, questions or comments about this last portion of Gideon?